Today, we are going to be talking about zones of exception, moral sandboxes, and the shadow self. And we're going to do it by framing it around an Atkinson and Rogers piece that we're going to reframe a little bit and summarize shortly, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's face it, humans are flawed. Our brains aren't always the most logical places and sometimes run at will with intrusive thoughts. These thoughts can be good or bad, evil or righteous, wholesome or deranged, and oftentimes outside of our control, hence the term intrusive. Many of these times, it would be frowned upon to take action on these thoughts, or perhaps simply not viable and outside the realm of possibility. Regardless, there is part of us that our fellow humans may rarely see, if ever. Enter Carl Jung's idea of the shadow self, the part of us that represents the repressed, denied, or feared parts of our psyches. This shadow self needs a safe place to escape to experiment with, or to simply understand itself. As the vessel for that shadow, we are responsible for ensuring that it is done in a safe, controllable manner. This makes the medium of video games an interactive, sometimes intricate, and often imaginary place uniquely suited for the task. Video games are sanctuaries for the shadow self. They are digital dreamscapes in which the subconscious can play, where the rules of society no longer apply, and eliminate the variable of judgment unless it's onto ourselves. While opinions on video games are wide-ranging, there is no doubt they become solitary zones of exception where we confront the impulses we hide, the choices we fear, and explore the selves we rarely admit to being. So let's talk about the Atkinson and Rogers piece. They wrote an article called Pleasure Zones and Murder Boxes, Online Pornography and Violent Video Games as Zones of Exception. We'll be basing a lot of this presentation off of that, but let's summarize it first. So zones of exception are spaces outside of normal social order. Actions here would normally be condemned and are temporarily allowed or normalized, hence the zone of exception. They also create a moral immunity because there are no real world consequences to our actions. We're able to experiment in here. Pleasure through power and control. Pornography and video games provide pleasure derived from an individual control. This power dynamic mirrors neoliberal ideas of sovereignty and hyper-individualized and consumerist form. The player or viewers are masters of that domain, and it's built to reward that dominance. Oftentimes, video games have some sort of reward system to motivate you to keep going. This indulgence makes these mediums alluring, yet morally suspect. So speaking to that, they are morally and culturally paradoxical, according to Atkinson and Rogers. Society condemns violence and exploitation, yet we consume this media in privacy all the time. It represents Western cultural hypocrisy, tensions between repression and indulgence. We're supposed to repress those sides of ourselves that we'll come to find out from Carl Jung inevitably exist. But yet we indulge in them all the time, particularly through video games or what we won't really be touching on, the pornography angle. It's becoming a rampant problem in the world. But these exceptions become normalized through repetition and commercialization. We play games all the time, and video games have become $100 million industry every single year. It's become people are playing it left and right, and there's a lot of money spent on these. So clearly, it plays a big role. Speaking of that role, it's also technology playing a role. So digital interfaces create the distance that we need to explore things safely. We know it isn't real, so it becomes safe to us because there's no repercussions to our actions within video games. But this distance weakens empathy, according to Atkinson and Rogers, which I think that changes a little bit, and we'll discuss it. Thing is that, however, these zones of exception become psychological safe houses for us to experiment with and explore. So enter Carl Jung's idea of the shadow self. Carl Jung developed a theory back in the 50s called the shadow theory. The shadow theory basically says that repressed, unchosen, and denied aspects of the psyche inevitably exist within all of us. And games help satisfy deep psychological needs and maybe the exploration of that shadow self. Games can be used as tools for emotional processing, resilience, and self-understanding. And games create meaningful spaces rather than corruptive ones. An interesting example of this is a video game here called Silent Hill 2, where the main player is actually living his nightmare. He's awake, living a nightmare. And all of the monsters that he faces are different parts of his psyche, all repressed parts of his psyche or trauma he's been through, and he has to fight them along the way, something that the player will come to understand later on. Games reflect the Jungian active imagination. Games function like waking dreams where the unconscious expresses itself freely and safely. A very literal example of this would be Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, where the main character, Link, constantly puts on masks throughout the game to help him embody a new person to accomplish a task in the game. It's not too dissimilar from the shadow self idea in the real world with us. Personas, projections, and identity exploration. Avatars become the masks we put on, and we project our internal dynamics onto them. RPGs are archetypal role plays, and the avatars become our persona and shadow expression. So, depending on what avatars we choose or build, they may be reflective of ourselves. Great example here is The Sims. Players often create ideal, chaotic, or shadow versions of themselves, and the whole point with The Sims is to see a simulated environment and how they interact with each other. Perfect way to explore this idea of the shadow self. So here's the deal. Zones of exception become a playhouse for the shadow self through a moral sandbox. We get to go ahead and play around with our morality. It can be used as more of a tool versus a detriment to us. So let's reframe the Atkinson and Rogers piece just a little bit here. So players become co-authors of the moral experience. Interactivity means that players generate moral meaning, not absorb it just passively. And developers can only give players the option to act in such a way. They can't demand that players actually go through with whatever action it is. And the best way to go about them is give them some sort of moral compass within the game. Great example of this is Red Dead Redemption 2. Players are given the choice to be good or bad, not simply passively experience it. They're actively playing a role with it. They can make good decisions, bad decisions, all of which are going to have outcomes in the game and affect the player and how they play through it. There's also catharsis through gameplay. Violent video games do not corrupt. They purge and regulate emotion as art traditionally does. Art can elicit happy feelings, sad feelings, and the artist usually portrays that themselves. They're just putting it onto a canvas or whatever medium they choose. Great example here is Doom, right? It's an ultra-violent video game that will provide a release, not aggression. Just because somebody's going to go and shoot a bunch of monsters doesn't mean they're going to go and look for them in the real world. They can have some sort of cathartic release and perhaps release some pent-up emotion that they might have had prior to playing. Avatars become a shadow mirror. Avatars reflect internal desires, insecurities, and impulses. Strong avatar player identification predicts psychological projection. A great example here is Cyberpunk 2077. You likely will choose a class that reflects you as a person, and the decisions made within the game likely reflect the gamer's morality. This is a reoccurring theme that we're always seeing here. Chances are you're going to pick an avatar in this game and you're going to act accordingly. There's a slight script that you play off of, but ultimately you're going to interject your own ideas onto the player and play as how you see fit. There's also a moral reflection through choice that video games give us. Games present moral dilemmas revealing the player's ethical center. Great example here is a video game LA Noire from the mid 2000s. Here you're a detective in LA, and the screenshot is actually from the game where the detective has just found out that it's his partner who has committed the murder, and he is now holding the murder weapon that he found in his car. So now he has a moral dilemma. Does he turn in his partner who he's worked with for years, or does he put him in jail and then make sure the right person goes in? Whatever choice the player makes within that game is going to have an outcome later on down the road. So zones of exception do not normalize harm either. And even Atkinson and Rogers kind of allude to this in their paper as well. They even say that video games create controlled arenas for self-confrontation, i.e., looking at the shadow self and how we can explore around with that. So simply put, there's a lack of correlation between violent video games and violent behavior. Let's talk about it. So, violence does not link to aggression. Evidence refutes the fact that violent video games do not cause violent action. Players can distinguish the difference between real world morality and fictional violence. Players can re engage with their personal morality after play. It doesn't mean that it's out the window the second they play a violent video game. Great example here is Call of Duty, especially multiplayer. Millions of users play this game and do not commit violent offenses afterwards. And they likely wouldn't be playing it if it wasn't for some sort of emotional cathartic release. It is one of the best selling games of all time. It's constantly played all over the world, but there's no evidence to link that that exposure to that kind of thing is actually having any sort of effect in the real world, right? So speaking of that catharsis as well, catharsis is real for habitual players. Frequent players believe and experience emotional releases. And I mean, I know this is a stock photo here on the right, but it's very true of any video gamer who's playing. If they're winning, they're happy. If they're losing, they're sad, as with anything. But this actually has a real release of emotion, whether it be pent up or something they're trying to explore. Shadow confrontation also strengthens, not weakens, our morality. Difficult games promote reflection and guilt, not desensitization to it, right? Perfect example of this is The Last of Us Parts 1 and 2. It takes place in this dystopian future, and the world has gone to hell through a virus. And it presents a lot of realistic scenarios, things that you might see in the real world, but the player has to make the choice to play through that. And how is it that they respond to it? Not only is there an emotional response in the game with the player, but the gamer themselves also feel it. It's a wonderful game that just presents players with difficult situations to explore and how they would react in such a way. So, in conclusion, video games offers a space that doesn't exist in the real world. It's a safe place where we can go and explore our own morality. They allow us to experiment with our shadow selves in a safe medium. What does my psyche want to do? Is it something that I've considered before? Let's experiment with it. Virtual violence shows no correlative effect on violent action. There's plenty of studies to show that just because I'm playing a violent video game does not going to mean that I'm going to go out and commit violent acts the next day. And video games allow us to dive deeper into our psyche and explore our own morality, our shadow selves. And we get to play in a zone of exception and explore in our moral sandbox, right? Video games can become a tool for us to explore who we are, what we would do in certain circumstances, and it doesn't mean that that violence is going to rub off and have any sort of negative effect. So I hope that's been a great idea of how video games can be used as a tool to explore our shadow self and reframe Atkinson and Rogers. And thank you.
And references.